Forgot to take my slide down. Hey, hey, and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here on blackdoctor.org. I am Ellis Dean, the Director of Programming and Production here at Black Doctor, and we are excited again to bring you part three. This is part three already. Wow, this has gone so fast, of our six-part series regarding Alzheimer's disease. So we want to say thank you to our partners at Cedars-Sinai Hospital, as well as Genentech, for helping us bring you this series. So this is all about your mind and protecting your mind. And even if you've had some early warning signs, there's still ways to reverse it and get things taken care of. And so if you haven't seen the previous two programs, I encourage you to go to our Facebook page or our YouTube channel and watch it. They are great productions. I'm not just saying that because Dr. Crimmins is the last one. It is really great information that we've learned over the past two shows. Today's show is really about the crux of the matter, because when we're talking about any type of condition, a condition has a treatment, right? The treatment might be medication, the treatment might be surgery, the treatment might be chemotherapy. There's a variety of different treatments for any condition, that medical condition that you come across. However, that treatment has to be researched, right? There's got to be a process that we go through to get an approved treatment, and that process is called a clinical trial. And I know those are dirty words in our community. I get it. But what I want people to recognize and realize, that participation in clinical trials, and these clinical trials, all of them, are paramount to getting more advancement in treatments, to better treatments. That's how clinical trials and the process is how we were able to get a COVID vaccine so quickly. I know there's political situations with that, but the reality is, without clinical trials, we would be really literally in the Stone Ages when it comes to healthcare. So Dr. Crimmins is going to give a great presentation on what clinical trials are. We're going to kind of answer your questions. If you have any questions about clinical trials, and we're here, and we're going to kind of talk through it. We're going to walk through it and really dive into what clinical trials are, what they aren't, and answer all the significant questions. So before I turn it over to our specialist today, a couple of things I need for you to do. Number one is let us know where you're watching from. So drop that in the comment section and let us know where you're watching from. The second thing I need for you to do is I need you to tag a friend or share it on your page, right? If this is some information that somebody needs, if they're going through something right now, or they've been through something and could participate, and their information could help others, share this, tag a friend. And finally, if you have any questions, please make sure you drop that in the comment section. We want to know and answer all of your questions. So I know you didn't log on to hear me talk. You came to see our special guest. So Dr. Crimmins, how are you? And the floor is now yours.
Great. Hi, it's great to be back. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm ready to go.
Okay, let's get this going. And let's get that up.
All right, great. So today we're going to talk about clinical trials and research participation. I am the director of the Neurobehavior Program at the Yonah Goldrich Center for Alzheimer's and Memory Disorders in the Department of Neurology at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Next slide, please. So these are my disclosures, which today are especially more pertinent. I have been a site principal investigator for various studies of Alzheimer's disease by various companies, but I have not received any payments for representing any pharmaceutical company. So I've been the person located at a hospital to help carry out the studies, but I am not part of these companies. Right, next. So we'll jump right into it. So what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial is a health-related study that investigates an intervention in a population of people that follows a predefined protocol. So what is really an intervention? What does that mean? So a lot of times the first thing we think about is that being a medication, a pharmaceutical. But an intervention doesn't have to be that. It could be a lifestyle change, like following people who participate in a certain kind of exercise regimen. It could be a certain type of behavioral therapy where, there's a certain intervention in terms of guiding people through, say, cognitive behavioral therapy versus something else. It could be a device. A lot of devices, for example, pacemakers or defibrillators or other things, go through a clinical trial as well. But when they develop, for example, new technology in the stroke world, when you come in for and you have an acute stroke and they see that they can intervene, not only might they give you a medication that they developed, again, with clinical trials to try to figure out if these advanced medications that if you come in within 3 hours, we might be able to reverse your symptoms, but they also have actual devices to hold open the artery that might be clogged. So that's a device that would be helpful in a trial. And they all follow a protocol. So there's a set of directions. It's kind of like a cookbook that everybody must follow the same way every single time. All right, next slide. So clinical trials are key. And I think that Ellis just said this, but really it's the only way for doctors and scientists to develop new and improved treatments for human diseases and conditions, right? Without trials, you can't have a new medication for your heart disease. You can't have a new medication for dementia, which they'll come once, they're on the way. We won't have something new for diabetes. We don't have the new pacemaker that's better than the old one. So the only way that we can move forward in healthcare is that there's got to be a way to test things in a rigorous way. Next slide. So who conducts a clinical trial? Well, clinical trials are really a group effort. So you have on the right-hand side of the slide, sponsor. So there's a lot of different people that can sponsor a trial. So oftentimes we think of pharmaceutical companies, but there are other people that also help provide the funding that's necessary to carry out a trial. Government agencies, for example, the National Institutes of Health, National Institutes on Aging, perhaps the Veterans Administration, those are just some examples. There are private foundations that specialize in certain kinds of diseases, say Alzheimer's or heart disease or whatever. They will raise money that then goes to help scientists and other people who are developing medications or devices to be able to test that in the community. And then there's academic institutions. There are researchers at universities who also can design a trial, but they need help to carry it out. It takes money to do that, right? You need to hire somebody to carry it out. You need all the different people that I'm about to mention to help carry that out. So a sponsor provides a lot of the architecture and the funding for the trial. The principal investigator might be the person that comes up with the idea, and it is the person who leads the trial. So they are in charge of making sure that everything is carried out the way it's supposed to be carried out, and they have people working as part of the team. So the research team are other doctors and nurses. It might be coordinators who are actually the people who answer the phone when you first call in and say, I might be interested in a trial. They're the ones who ask you questions, schedule the appointment, they meet you when you arrive, and they help do all of the, take your blood pressure, all these things when you're at the trial appointment. There also may be physical therapists. There may be all kinds of pieces, but just remember, it just depends on what the trial is about. Next slide.
Quick question, Dr. Kremen.
Yes.
Is there just one principal investigator for a trial?
So at any one individual site, for example, if it's a multi-site trial, meaning say it's a big national study, right? Then you're going to enroll, say you need 3,000 people so that you can, you need 10,000 people. Yeah, that can't be done at one place. Obviously, that would be too far away for many people, too hard to do. So at each individual place, there would be a principal investigator. But then, yes, above all those principal investigators, there will be somebody who is in charge overall for the entire study. So who oversees trials? This is very important, right? Because we need to make sure that the trials are done appropriately. So there are many people who are responsible. So obviously, the clinical trial site itself and the principal investigator who works there is in charge of the day-to-day, everyday oversight of their team, making sure everything's done appropriately. The other people who are working with that principal investigator are a bunch. So you have the sponsor, they write the protocol perhaps, or they know of the protocol and they are helping to make sure that everything that the principal investigator needs, they have all the supplies and that they are being used appropriately. You have institutional review board. So what is an institutional review board? An institutional review board, or also known as IRB, It's an administrative body that's established to protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects that are recruited into participate into these trials. So they review a study before it even gets approved to be run. And they will question the sponsor and they will question the principal investigator and say, well, are you going to be enrolling people who might be at disadvantage, who could be taken advantage of? For example, people with dementia. How are you going to handle that? Are you going to make sure that somebody else is there to make sure that they actually assent, even if they can't consent to this study? How are you going to make sure that they are protected? That's the goal of the Institutional Review Board, is to make sure that it's ethical. Typically, it's made up of at least, it could be 5 people, it could be 10 people, but it's made up of various people of different backgrounds. So there will be some researchers, there will be some doctors who are clinical, there will be a lawyer usually, there will be some people who have, social relations, within the hospital that are looking at ethics. And usually there are also members of the community in your community who are citizen members who also overlook it. Particularly, they help in reading over, for example, the consent forms that everybody has to sign which is the agreement to do the study. And they make sure that everything is really understandable and that it makes sense that anybody would participate in it and that doesn't seem harmful. So that's the role of the Institutional Review Board. Then you have usually some sort of department. It's an Office of Human Research Protection program that oversees all research on a medical campus. And the IRB is just part of that. But essentially, it also helps, like if somebody is in a trial and they have a concern as a participant, they can go to this Office of Human Research Protection program and say, I have a concern. And it is this office's job to look into whatever their concern is to make sure that things are being done appropriately. The other people that also oversee this are FDA and other federal agencies that may be involved. For example, it could be CDC, it could be National Institutes on Aging, whoever else needs to be involved, depending on the kind of trial it is. Okay, next slide. So I stole this from the UK. This is from the United Kingdom, but I really liked it and I think it's helpful, so I use it because it's very similar. So there are various phases, and you might see that if you're looking up things about trials and you're interested. So after the information is done in the research lab with the rats and the mice, once they've done that, that's preclinical. Okay, so there's preclinical. Things can't even go to clinical if you don't have preclinical data. So once you have preclinical information, then you can start a phase 1 study. Phase 1 does not use very many people. It might be 20 people, it might be 50 people, and it's usually enrolling people who are fairly young and healthy. And the only goal is really to figure out what dosage they can use, how much is too much, what are the potential harms, and what are the side effects. That's basically what happens. They're not trying to figure out if it works. They're just trying to figure out, is it safe enough to give a human? So people who are phase 1 are kind of brave people who serve a very important role, because otherwise we couldn't get further.
Pioneers. They're the pioneers.
Yes, pioneers. The phase 2 is a larger study. Maybe it's 50 people, maybe it's 200 people. And now you're testing it in the actual population of people you're interested in. So for example, in trials for dementia or Alzheimer's disease, then you're going to be enrolling people who have Alzheimer's disease according to some sort of criteria on a test. And essentially the goal is to figure out whether this is an effective treatment in that population. And again, really looking at the side effects. And you are now testing it against a sham medication. So you'll have the real medication, and then you have something that looks just like it that's called placebo. And you're trying to figure out between the two groups whether the one who got the drug is more effective than the people who didn't get the drug. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that process later. The phase 3 then, if phase 2 it looks okay and the drug looks like it's not too harmful and that it may have benefit, they need to show that again. So they'll do it again in a much bigger study, and that's phase 3. Phase 3 is where you may have 1,000 participants, 3,000 participants, 5,000, depending on what number you need in order to be able to really show that that you can show benefit, or that whatever you see is a significant effect. And so this is really testing whether the medication has a beneficial effect. It may involve many different sites across a country or internationally. There might be many sites. And again, you're going to be comparing this particular medication or intervention against something that's a sham or placebo. Okay. And if that goes forward, then you can, then it goes, at least in this country, this is where we have to sort of do the detour off of this slide, but it goes from, in this country, it doesn't go to NICE. It will then go to FDA and et cetera. So then it will, go to be sent to FDA for them to consider whether it's approved or not. All right, next slide. So why do we design, and what really goes into designing a study? Well, when we design a study, it's really, the goal is to answer a question, right? So I've put in an example question. So does a certain medication improve memory in patients who have mild dementia? So they've had a drop in their cognition and their function. That's mild dementia. And so people might take this medication. They have to have mild dementia from Alzheimer's disease. Will this medication improve their memory? That's our question. Next slide. And so we have to generate a hypothesis. And a hypothesis basically is just a proposed explanation that says we're going to test this through experiments and observations. So our hypothesis could be that this drug X will improve memory in patients with mild Alzheimer's disease. And we're going to figure out whether it is effective by using a memory test that we can get a score from. And that will say, yes, that's our hypothesis. But the alternate hypothesis is this drug will not improve memory in patients with mild Alzheimer's disease measured by that same test, right? This is our hypothesis, that either the drug, it will, and the alternate hypothesis is that it won't. And that's what we're going to study. Okay, next slide. So the gold standard study is randomized, double-blind, and placebo-controlled. And we're going to talk about what each of those things means. The first thing is randomized. So participants are randomized to receive the intervention or the placebo. It's like it is rolling the dice, and there's usually some sort of protocol in place to make it extremely random so that the sponsor is not really in control of it. The principal investigator is not in control of it. The participant is not. It's randomized no matter what, to make sure that it's fair. Next slide. So randomization really is just an assignment into different groups, right? And that should be a random process and not be controlled or influenced by the investigator, not the sponsor, can't be controlled by the participant. And it really ensures that the inherent differences that might exist between groups do not bias anything, right? That you have something could equally appear in the test group and the placebo group equally. Next slide. Now, the next thing is that it should be double blind. Again, randomized, double blind, placebo controlled. So what does double blind mean? Double blind means that the participants and the researchers, neither one of them know which group, the people who are participants, they don't know what they're getting. So in the participant group, in the blue box, you see there are people, and you've got 3 people, and it just happens 2 of them got the placebo, which is the sham medication or the sham intervention, and 1 has gotten the actual intervention, but none of them know. But you can see that my researcher in the orange, that person also doesn't know. And that's what makes it, again, fair, so that nobody is being treated differently during the whole course of the study.
Yeah, that's my next question is like, why is double blind the best methodology? So you just answered that. And I have one real world example. I had there was a physician that was a regular on Black Doctor, and she participated in the COVID clinical trials. And she had a video of her reveal when they revealed which group she was in. And she did it because she didn't know, and neither did the researchers.
Right.
So they were finding out at the same time.
Exactly. It's exciting. All right. And so the last part of this is, you've heard me now say this word a bunch of times, but placebo controlled. So what is placebo? Placebo just means that it's a sham pill or a sham procedure. All that means is that it's a sugar pill. It has to stand in and look exactly like the real thing, right? Because we don't want somebody to know what group they're in. And so we have to keep everything looking the same so that everybody gets treated the same way, everybody feels the same way, and so that you can eliminate any bias. So, somebody gets randomized, they take it, they can't tell, and neither can the investigator if they were to look at it, if they have a pill, which one is the one that's real and which one is the one that's pretend. Next slide. So why go to all this trouble, right? It's a lot of trouble, but we're really trying to prevent bias and to get the most accurate and precise results, because, bias really is just this intentional or unintentional favoring of one group or one outcome over the other, or over other potential groups or outcomes, right? We may really want this medication to work, and we might really want it to work for this person because, we really want it to help them. But that bias leads to invalid data, false conclusions, and could really send us down the wrong path in terms of healthcare. So a good trial, and I put in parentheses, a good researcher is neutral in their intention, in the design of a study, and in the outcome. That's the only way it can really work, is they can't have, an emotion about it. They just have to be very neutral and do everything fairly. Next slide. So how do these work? How do clinical trials work? We're going to go through the process of what happens when you're thinking about going through the process of eligibility in a study. So you have a pool of people who might be eligible, right? They might have the qualifications that you need to be in a study. But what does that really mean? You might be interested, and you might be eligible, but we have to figure out who can actually go on in the screening process of a study. So there are inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria are factors that must be there in order for the person or who's considering it, this patient, say they're in the hospital or whatever and they're sick, to demonstrate, to be able to actually participate in the study, okay? So that means you've been, for example, you've had heart disease for 4 years, or you must be between the ages of 50 and 85. Those are examples of inclusion criteria, right? You have to have the disease that they're trying to study, or else you won't, that makes sense. But there are other things too. Age, it could be that you need to have a family history, whatever. But there's also exclusion criteria depending on different studies. And these are factors that exclude the patient from participation if they have these different factors. So other diseases that might, besides what's being studied, for example, you'll find in a lot of Alzheimer's studies that if you have any evidence of vascular disease on your brain scan, if you have cerebral vascular disease or a history of stroke, then you're going to be excluded. Or if you have significant depression, because we know depression can interfere with memory, and we're trying to study, a drug that has to do with memory, we'll say if you have significant ongoing difficult depression, then you may not be able to be in the study at this time until it's controlled. Sometimes if you're taking too many other medications, or there's some medication, there might be a contraindication because there's a potential that the study medication would interact with a medication that you're already taking, then you might not be able to be in a study. So there are various reasons why somebody might be excluded. But it's not, we're not pointing fingers. These are just, reasons. All right. So next slide. So then what will happen is, as we're considering whether somebody's eligible, if they seem like they will be eligible, then we also have to do informed consent. So this is extremely, extremely important. And we're going to talk a little bit on the next slide about what informed consent really means. Okay. So informed consent is a detailed but understandable explanation of the risks, procedures, and requirements of study participation. So what happens is, when you go for that initial visit, when it's a screening exam, before anybody does anything, before you do anything, before they take any blood, before they ask you any questions, before you do anything in this study, the first thing that has to happen is that the principal investigator or their representative, it could be a nurse practitioner, it could be another study physician, they must do informed consent with you. Essentially what it looks like is a bunch of papers, and it will basically outline what is the purpose of the study, who's running the study, who is sponsoring the study, who is going to be the study team, What are we going to be doing as part of the study? What are all the activities that you as a potential participant will need to do? For example, how many times are you going to need to come into this study site? Where is the study site? Will you need to give blood? Will you need to do an MRI? Might they ask you to do a spinal tap? Might they do some cognitive testing? And then each one of those activities will be laid out in terms of risks, in terms of benefits, and then you'll be also given a study schedule. How long will this study last? Can you drop out? And the answer always is yes, always, because every study is a volunteer study. You can never be strong-armed into a study. So every study is a voluntary study, okay? And this document has to be gone over in detail, and you don't sign it until all of your questions are answered. This is the opportunity for your answers, for your questions and answers to happen. And whoever is consenting you should not let you sign it unless you truly understand it, which means that after they go over everything, they should be asking you questions. Do you understand what this study is about? Can you tell me 2 things about what this study, what we're going to ask you to do to be part of this study? Do you understand who you'd call if you needed help? Do you understand who to call if you have questions about the study? Can you tell me some alternatives to not participating in this study? Can you tell me what you would do if you didn't want to be in this study? If you can't answer those questions and they have not given you that information, you don't sign it, because you have to know. This is your right to know. And again, I just want to emphasize, this is voluntary. A clinical trial is always voluntary. An observational study is always voluntary. You should always be able to withdraw at any time without any consequences or repercussions. So if somebody comes to if you go, say, to your healthcare provider, and you want to be in a clinical trial, and then in the end you decide you don't want to do it, that is your right. And they will not take away taking care of clinical care for you, because research is one thing, clinical care is another. There should be no repercussions. So I hope this was very clear, because this is a very, very important part of clinical trials.
It's also, another 2 words we can use is full disclosure, right? So they're going to fully disclose what the trial is about, what your responsibilities are, what they're asking you to do. You don't even have responsibilities because you can drop out at any time, but what they're asking you to do as a participant in this particular trial. And I love the fact that what Dr. Crimin is talking about in terms of making sure they ask you questions to say, okay, how much do you really understand? Or are you just shaking your head yes and signing because you don't really know? And a lot of us do that. I do it too. When we go buy a car, we're very excited when they hand us those keys. We just, okay, whatever I need to sign, and don't realize your interest rate just went up a point. But speaking about personal experience, we're talking about clinical trials right now. So, but no, seriously, this is really about full disclosure. And I think for our people of color that are watching this program, it's important to recognize that informed consent was a big thing that came out as a result of the Tuskegee, for lack of a better term, study being exposed to the public. And so informed consent and that IRB are really, really kind of birthed from that 1973 kind of expose of the Tuskegee experiment.
Exactly right. All right, next slide. So then you go through informed consent, you say yes, everybody says great, and you've made the inclusion-exclusion. So then you'll go under randomization, right? And essentially, at this point, it's usually computer generated. So, the research coordinator will basically be given, directions on what to do. So you're going to get randomized to either get the intervention or the sham. And then the next slide, after that, basically, there you go. You get treatment or no treatment. Next slide. And then you're going to be doing this for, 18 months, 12 weeks, however long the study is. And once it's done, then, we do an end of study visit, and then there's analysis of the data. The data is always confidential. It is always, we always talk about how we try to keep everything confidential. That means it stays within the study team. The IRB has access if they need it, but they don't really typically check it unless they're looking for ethical issues. The sponsor can look at it. FDA will want to look at it. But in general, it's confidential, and it's research. It's not connected to your clinical record. It's its own thing. and it's protected. And once there's analysis of the data, then there can be a conclusion based upon the results. So did this intervention work or did it not for whatever condition, that we're studying? Next slide. So there are risks and discomforts that you, again, will find you should be apprised of during the informed consent, right? Some of the risks and discomforts, and there's many of them, but here are some. You don't get to decide whether you get to placebo or active treatment. And for some people, they consider it to be a risk to be put into the placebo group, but that is a risk. So if you can't live with that risk, maybe you wouldn't be in a clinical trial if it just bothers you too much. But that's a risk, right? There is a potential for potentially unpleasant, serious, or in some cases, life-threatening side effects. Again, that should be covered in the consent form. There's no guarantee that a new treatment is going to be more effective than previous treatments. That's always the risk, right? Now, this could be seen as a risk and discomfort or a positive, depending on how you feel about it, but more times in visits to the physician. So yes, I will say that if you participate in clinical trials, it is a responsibility, and it does add something to your schedule, because now you're adding it, amongst all the other things that you're doing. You have to show up, say, it depends what the trial is, once a month or, every 2 months, every 3 months. And you have to, devote some time. It might be an hour, it might be a whole day, each time you go. Now, the upside is that you are getting monitored and getting like a little bit more of a touch from the medical profession. So you can see that as a benefit. Some people like that because they feel like just getting to go and talk to the person who's running the study. They're a researcher. They get to be on the inside, right? Kind of ask questions that they wouldn't normally be able to get answers to about, like, hey, what's coming? What's the new exciting thing that's going on in Alzheimer's disease or whatever? And one other risk and discomfort, that you don't think about, but there's unknown risks. Sometimes, even though we state everything as best as we can in that informed consent form, sometimes there's just things that are unforeseen. Now, they all get recorded and they all get shared amongst all of the sites. So every week when you are running a study, you get updated about anything that's happened across any study site. And you, as a site investigator, must review it and must decide if your own institutional review board needs to know about it, and whether you as a site are going to make any action based upon what you've found out.
Yeah, I think while it on the one side, and I understand why we put it on this list in terms of more time visits to the physician as a risk or discomfort, I see it as a net positive, because to your second point, is like you do get the chance to, even if you're in the placebo group, you get to have those conversations, and you get to have, and it's particularly if it's a condition that you are currently experiencing that they're studying, you really get to have that in-depth understanding and knowledge from a group of healthcare professionals. So that's a net positive. Now, of course, it does impact in terms of time, travel, whatever. And some studies do reimburse for that. It depends on the study and how the study was put together. But I see that as a net positive,
All right. So we alluded to this already. And so we're going to address this head on, right? Clinical trials, particularly in peoples of color and also in other communities in World War II, clinical trials have had a checkered past. Okay. So Tuskegee, as many of you know, this started actually, it's incredible, but it was in 1932. So that's 90 years ago now. This is the anniversary. And essentially, it was a study to record the natural history of syphilis in Black American males. But what was really terrible about it was nobody got informed consent. Nobody was treated when a treatment came out in the 1940s. And essentially, this was only uncovered in 1972. So that's 50 years ago, that it was actually exposed for what it was, which was that people were essentially being treated for bad blood and were not being helped when they could have. And not only did that affect these men because they died, they didn't need to die. They could have been treated, but their families weren't told, their kids were not told. And so whole families and social structures were affected. It was completely unethical. And of course, you can just understand why this generated so much mistrust, because how could it not? The same thing happened with Henrietta Lacks. So she was a woman who ended up having adenocarcinoma, and she died in 1951. And because they were looking at, what you do when you go in and when you have cancer, obviously they have to take it out and they look at it to try to figure out what kind of cancer it is. So at the time they were wrong about the kind of cancer she had. That's okay, because at that time we didn't probably have the kind of stains and other things that we can look at under the pathological microscope that we can today. So in that part, it's okay. They didn't know what kind she had, but what happened is that it turned out that she had the kind of cancer that could regenerate. And scientists realized that they were kind of immortal. These cells are immortal. And it turned out that her cell line got used in so many different experiments without her knowledge, without her consent, without her family's consent. And it has led to amazing medical breakthroughs.
Yep.
But nobody asked if it was okay. And this is how, unfortunately, a lot of research was done in 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. In 1973, there was a class action suit, right, against this kind of thing happening with Tuskegee. And there were several things that came out of it. On the next slide, I'll just go over a couple of things. This is just a couple. But essentially what happened was in 1974, there was the National Research Act that was passed. And this basically identified basic principles of what needed to happen in terms of proper research conduct and suggested ways that these principles had to be followed. Regulations were followed or passed in terms of requiring researchers to get voluntary informed consent in all people participating in studies that were funded by Department of Health, Department of Education and Welfare. You also had the Belmont Report in 1979, which I can tell you because now I'm involved in research. Anybody who does research, no matter what level, it can be a doctor, a nurse, a coordinator, anybody who has anything to do with research, even just somebody putting in the data, learns about the Belmont Report. We have to go through training. And the Belmont Report was very, very important and the culmination of an ethics advisory board that was formed basically to review ethical issues in biomedical research. And they came up with 3 basic principles: respect for person, so respect all people, don't take advantage of people; beneficence, do things for the good; and justice, be fair. Because what happens is, and they make special rules. So there are special populations that are identified in research. For example, children, pregnant women, prisoners, who they're at the mercy of, there's a hierarchy, right? Kids can't sign for themselves, right? People can take advantage of them. Prisoners, they're stuck. They could be forced to do things. No, you can't do that. That's what this says. So the last thing that I mentioned here is from 1991, there was a federal policy for the protection of human subjects where essentially 16 federal agencies and departments signed on to adopt a set of rules and it keeps going. There's many, many other things and they keep getting updated. So this stuff is from the past, but I can just tell you that it is an ongoing process and there are ongoing policies and procedures and boards that keep updating things. So just so you know that this kind of thing, what happened in the past should not happen anymore. That really, there's a lot of education and top-down regulation going on.
I think I'm going to take a brief point of personal privilege here. As a person of color, as a Black man, one of the first things I learned about, and especially when I went to college, was Tuskegee, right? That was the kind of and you got some information on it, and you just said okay, and that led to this, and this distrust of healthcare in general, in a general sense, particularly of clinical trials. But then as I became an adult and started working in healthcare, and then I wrote a paper, so I did a lot of research on the Tuskegee study as it was done, and then what came after the Tuskegee study, and as a result, while it was still egregious, there's not enough words to kind of describe what was done in that study. There has been good. as a result of that whistleblower kind of shedding light on that particular study. And it's not a get over it type situation. It is we're going to hold healthcare accountable for every single trial. We still need to participate. I am standing on that hill and I'm going to die on that hill. We still need to participate because that's the only way we can get better medications, the only way we can get better treatments for people of color. We cannot let that just be normed on a specific gender or a specific ethnic group. At the same time, we use what happened in the past as a barometer for what's going on today and in the future. And so that's what we have to do. That's the stance we have to take. It's been 50 years since that study came to light. It's been 50 years. I feel old now, but it's 50 years since that study came to light. If we are going to hold on to that, something that, that started in 1932, so we're talking about 90 years, then we're automatically assuming there has been no progress in this country. And I can't just accept that after seeing all of these great studies come out since the Tuskegee experiment was revealed and exposed. So we really kind of have to reframe our mindset. Don't forget, use it as a barometer, but we cannot let it hold us back from participating in clinical trials. So I got on my soapbox again. I'm sorry. All right. That's slide here.
All right. So I'm just going to speak a little bit more to that because of this. So, reasons that when people have actually done other kinds of studies, interviewing people of color about what are the biggest reasons for not participating in research. I mean, this comes fear of being a guinea pig. 69% of those who were surveyed, that was one of the things that they mentioned. 40% of those surveyed mentioned concern of getting sick from a trial. 62% believe that medical research is biased against people of color. And there's been a lot of concern that belief in signing that informed consent form meant relinquishing autonomy and providing legal protection to doctors, which it isn't, but that, that's what it feels right. You're signing your life away and that you have no control, but that's not what it actually is. There have been other things as well. For example, not feeling like they have enough information, not being comfortable with the risks of the study, not really getting a chance to have the study drug because they don't like, if it's say, there's a risk of placebo and it's 2 to 1, you still have a 1 out of 3 chance of not getting, the intervention, maybe concerned about the study procedures or where the study is located, that kind of thing. But these are the biggest things that I'm showing here. Next slide. So let's just look at this a little bit. So this is data from 2019. On the left-hand side, you see the ring that shows out of all the people that participate, on the left-hand side is the percentage of people who are African-American or Black living in the US, so 13.4% at that time. On the right-hand side, what you see is the percent of Black or African-American participants in trials, so 9%. So it's not matching the population. So there's a 67% proportionate representation. So for every 3 white people, there's only 2 Black people participating in studies. So there's underrepresentation. And, when you look at the Latino population, it's even a bigger disparity. For example, it's about 18 to 20% of the population, and maybe it's only about 3% of participation in trials. There's an even bigger gap. So next study. So what's the problem with lack of diversity in clinical trials? And we've sort of just started to talk about this a little, but most medical knowledge from the past is based on white males, and women and minorities have been underrepresented. And that's a problem because there are differences between gender, race, ethnicity, and those differences may be really critical for determining what medications and what dosages may be safe. What might be effective for one person may not be effective for another. But if we don't have everybody in participation, we won't find that out and we won't uncover that. Next slide. So why participate in a clinical trial? So here's the dementia researcher's point of view, right? From our point of view, we know that there is woeful lack of representation in terms of racial and ethnic groups. There's a significant underrepresentation in dementia research. I can just tell you now. It's something that is on everybody's mind in terms of like every conference I go to. And this is important because we don't, again, know if the changes in this disease itself, in Alzheimer's and other types of dementia, we don't know if it's the same in people of color as it is in whites. And that's really important. So if we don't have diversity in trials, we can't understand whether the drugs that are being developed are useful or effective in people of color. We just can't know that. So how can we be helpful? And how are we going to learn anything? On the flip side, right, why participate in a clinical trial? Now there's the potential participant's point of view. Well, first of all, there's an access to new treatment before they're widely available. As we can say, the first person who's going to benefit from a medication is going to be in a clinical trial, right? Next, it's an opportunity to take an active role in your own healthcare, right? You're interested, you want to take a shot at something, you're already on the right medications, but you want something else. This is a great opportunity because it really does get you more closer to what's going on, what's the heartbeat of, medicine, and getting to talk to researchers and be part of that, really be part of that process and help. Next, getting expert medical care at academic institutions. You really do get that. And next, as Ellis has already eloquently said, we have to help push science forward, because I've also been part of a lot of different, church events where I've also spoken about this, and people at the church events who are members of the churches have said to their congregations and had told me that, yes, Tuskegee, it was horrendous. It's inexcusable. And yet, if we don't participate, we're going to be left behind. And the only thing we're going to have is medications for people who are white. But we need to know about medications for other people. And if we don't, why aren't we participating? We're going to hurt our own community. We need to help and lift up our community, and this is how we do it. Next slide. So here's another reason why to participate in a trial. So Alzheimer's disease, at least for Alzheimer's trials, Alzheimer's is the fourth leading cause of death in older African-American Black individuals. Fourth leading cause. And we know that not only are African-Americans, have 44% more likely to die of a stroke after having a stroke, 23% more likely to have obesity, 25% more likely to have heart disease, 72% more likely to be diabetic, but also they're going to make up 40% with Latino communities. They're going to make up 40% of the 8.4 million Americans who are projected to be living with Alzheimer's disease in 2030. That's a lot of people. And if we don't know how to treat people appropriately, and we're missing the boat because we're only using medications that we know have been tested in people who are white, and we don't, and we use those, we're going to use them in people of color. But if there's something better or different that we should be doing, we need to know that. That's just important for, medical care, proper medical care. Next slide. So, moving on from that, I am not going to attempt to really deconstruct this slide. It's a slide that gets updated every year. And what it's showing you is that right now we have over 140 or so medications that are in the pipeline to look at Alzheimer's disease and try to treat it. You can see that there are the three phases. The most outer circle is those that are in phase 1. So we have less of those because those are smaller and harder to do. We've got tons in phase 2, which is the middle circle. And then in the very center, you have phase 3, because it's hard to make it all the way to phase 3. It takes a long time, and it's very rigorous to try to get to phase 3. If you look at the different colors, what you'll see is that green is something that's disease modifying. That means that it's trying to actually target the underlying proteins that cause Alzheimer's disease. And then you have purple, which is also disease modifying, but these are actually medications that you can take by a pill. The ones that are green are more like infusions that use antibodies. Then you have the blue ones. These are more that are symptomatic treatment. So these are more looking at how to support the behaviors that come out, like depression or agitation or other things like that. And then last, you have this orange section, which is cognitive enhancers. These are things that boost up cognition, that boost up memory, but they're not dealing with the underlying biology. Beyond that, I'll just say that there's a lot of different scientific approaches. Some of them are targeting amyloid, some are targeting tau. Those are both the proteins that are underlying Alzheimer's disease, but we have a lot of other ones targeting inflammation, et cetera. You could do a whole slideshow just on this. So we will move on because it's very in depth. But just to get the idea, we're not sitting around. There's a lot going on.
And if you want to learn more about those proteins, you can watch our previous show with Dr. Kremen, and we talked about what the predominant protein that influences Alzheimer's in that last show. So please go back and watch that show. It's on our YouTube or our Facebook page. So go back and watch that show.
Right. And this is just a slide showing, say somebody has vascular dementia, that you can see that over time, there have also been a growth. I mean, there's really been a boom in terms of the number of trials. And again, you can see the types of trials. So, targeting antioxidant, metabolic sources, all kinds of different things. So just to know that there are a lot of trials going on for different types of cognitive difficulties and dementia that you can look into. Next slide. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the difference between an observational study and a clinical trial. So observational studies and clinical trials are both health-related studies. The difference is that an observational study, there's no intervention. Basically, it's enrolling people, like if you've ever heard of the Framingham Health Study, where they've been following people now for a really long time, people who develop heart disease, and then they're looking at the outcomes over time of what happens to those people who develop heart disease. It's basically to understand a condition as it develops and as it changes, and to kind of understand who's at risk for who's going to develop the disease, why somebody develops a disease, but there's no intervention. It's really a natural study where you're not changing anything. A clinical trial, there's an intervention, right? And it's understanding how a particular intervention may change or a disease or prevent the disease outcome. Either way, they're all regulated by the IRB, by OHRPP, by the sponsor. Either way, you have to sign consent form. There's nothing different in that. If it's research, it's research. But I just wanted to talk about the different types of things because observational is a little bit different. All right, next slide. So again, these are elements so the elements for observational research studies that they may be looking into, we might want to be looking at medical history, the amount of exercise you've had historically, your education, genetics, diet, your family or support network, economic situation, mental health or sleep, lots of different things. And so you may be asked to do different kinds of activities like answer questionnaires, give blood samples, get brain scans, take cognitive tests, but it's not going to be compared against any kind of placebo, right? It's just going to be following a group of people and trying to understand it as it goes along. Next slide. So here's a great example of one that's really important that is at multiple centers across the country. We're trying to understand what is the cognitive outcome of people having strokes, because we know that vascular dementia is a really important thing affecting people, particularly because there's so many people that have strokes. And we know that a significant portion of people may develop cognitive problems afterwards, but we don't understand enough about that. So this is one study where it's more of an observational study where, the inclusion criteria is you have to have had a stroke. So you can't be in it if you haven't had a stroke. But beyond that, really, they're going to be following all kinds of people if you've had a stroke. So it's a really interesting and important thing, an important study that's being run right now. It's just getting started up in a lot of places across the country. So lastly, how do I find a clinical trial or research study? So there's a national website, clinicaltrials.gov. Every study that's being done in this country must register with the government. They must register. And all of those registrations go to clinicaltrials.gov. You can find out where the trial is happening. You can do a search looking for a particular city or a particular type of medical condition. You can find all the places where it's running and a phone number. There are other places like Center Watch. And of course, I'm giving this because this is very Alzheimer's focused. Alzheimer's Association may list them. Us Against Alzheimer's is another good place to look. Your local university medical center oftentimes will be running things. And many of these organizations will provide information on trials and studies about vascular dementia also, and other types, Parkinson's disease, dementia, et cetera. And that is it. So that's the last slide for here. So I'm sure that we might have some questions.
There was one significant quote. It was the same person, and she was interested in participating in clinical trials, and then she asked a question about the heritability of Alzheimer's. And so, is it heritable? Is it hereditary? Sorry, and if so, how much?
Right. So that's a great question. So to some degree, Alzheimer's can be hereditary. if you have a parent or a first-degree relative with Alzheimer's, then you yourself may be at 1.5 times risk of developing it. It's not for certain, but it's a risk. So it's not a guaranteed outcome that you will develop it. There are some people who have a gene called ApoE4. ApoE4, all of us get a copy of ApoE from our mother and one from our father, and there are 3 different kinds. It's like we each get 2 ice cream cones, and then there's flavors, right? So chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. So ApoE2 could be chocolate, ApoE3 could be vanilla, and ApoE4 could be strawberry, right? So you can pick, but you don't get to pick because you're born. But anyway, you get 1 copy from your mom and 1 from your dad. So ApoE4 confers the greatest risk. So if you get 1 copy of ApoE4 from a parent, then it increases your risk by 4 times. If you get 2 copies, it does increase your risk by 12 times. It still doesn't guarantee that you're going to develop Alzheimer's disease, but it does increase your risk. Then there's a small group of people who, like 1% of people, maybe less than 1% of people who get Alzheimer's disease, who develop early onset Alzheimer's disease, and there are 3 different genes that are autosomal dominant. What that means is they will get the disease. This is different than a risk gene. This is they will get it.
Okay.
And so the genes are presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and APP, amyloid precursor protein gene. But these are in families. Every single level of the family, you will find multiple people who have it. And if they pass it on to their kids, they will get it. But that's not the usual for people who have Alzheimer's disease.
So ways to protect yourself. If you want to know specifically, there's a lot of companies that do genetic testing. So you can get genetic testing and then you can get your results read or interpreted for you. As a result, you can take this program with you on your phone if you want to look up those genes to see if it's in there. But they will interpret those results for you so you can get genetic testing. The other thing is you can get a detailed family history. Many people don't have that. They just kind of leave that blank and move on. So I would say as we're moving into holiday season coming up in the next couple of months, as you're sitting around at a table and having those discussions and or arguments around the table, just start doing a detailed family history, specifically of direct parents, siblings, and grandparents. That would be kind of a good way to get an understanding of what your family history is, and then you can get some genetic testing done on your own to have that. I will add one more resource center. BlackDoctor.org is in the process of developing a clinical trials resource center where we're going to have articles and videos like this on there for people to come to our site and also find clinical trials that are ongoing that are specific to people of color, so they can go there, learn about these particular trials, and get enrolled if they want to directly through BlackDoctor.org, and that'll be launching here in the next couple of weeks. And so we're really just excited about that because this is not something that we take lightly. We're fully invested into this. So here we're at the bottom, at the top of our hour. This has been fantastic, Dr. Crimmins. Again, kudos to you. Thank you to Cedars-Sinai for helping us put together this series, and then I thank you to Genentech for being a good partner with regards to putting this series together. So, if you have any questions, we're going to re-air this. Like and share this program. We want to get this information out to as many people as possible. My 3 favorite words when it comes to clinical trials are involvement improves outcomes. Keep those 3 things in your mind. Get involved in clinical trials now, or tell a friend to get involved in clinical trials. It will improve our lives and the lives of our children and next generation. Thank you again, and we'll see y'all next time.
Thank you.